Well, here we go. After this lecture, you've done it for the 5th time through 5 chapters. You've learned half of the material for this course and thus half of the material needed to pass the ISC2 Certified in Cybersecurity exam. I hope you're enjoying the content. Let's jump to our last section, which is access controls. So again, remember the AAAs all play together, right? They're interchangeable in a means, and the majority of security systems are going to cover authentication, authorization, and access controls. So access controls are security measures that regulate who can view, use, or modify resources within an information system. Ensuring only authorized individuals have the necessary permissions. And by the way, this includes system administrators. So just because you're administrator doesn't mean you're going to have administrative rights to do everything, okay? We talk about segregation of duties, and that is hugely important, more important in an administrative aspect, because we want to make sure that system administrators are only administrators for the portion of the network that they administer, right? Boy, that's a lot of administration, isn't it? So these controls are essential for maintaining data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That CIA triad. So pretty important, right? That's where we focus everything. That's why we learn that right off the bat in chapter 1. So before we talk about access controls, we need to understand access control models, okay? And you're going to see questions like I did on the ISC2 for these. So an object is a passive information system related entity that contains or receives information, okay? So accessing a file on a computer allows the user to read, write, or delete the data, right? So normally, if you're the author, you're the one that creates the file, you tend to get full permissions, read, modify, and delete, and in some cases are able to then extend permissions to ensure that other users can say only read, okay? So examples of objects are devices, okay? Do we have access to printers, USB? What files do we have access? Records, tables in a database? What processes can we run? There's certain things that we want to keep end users from doing on a client computer, not only so that we don't have the oops, I don't know what I did, now fix it, but also to secure that client, secure the endpoint, right? Programs, domains. So, objects are the target entities that are assessed by subjects, which we'll talk about, okay? So, these are the things. I like to call the objects the things, okay? And that then, here's an example of objects, right? Files, etc. I really dig these AI generate. You give it enough information, it definitely generates some pretty cool images, although I don't know what this medical thing is here. That leaves us into subjects. So subjects is generally an individual, a process, or a device, right? Causing information to flow among objects or changes to the system state. So, subjects are active entities that interact with objects. So the objects are the things, the subjects are the things that interact with it, okay? Active. Example, a user logging into a system or a process running on a server acts as a subject interfacing with the various objects. So, a subject might be a backup user, performing the backup, the object of, a backup system, okay? So examples, users, again, processes. So that backup operator may have rights to back up, but not to restore, okay? Least privilege. That also goes into that whole segregation of duties, right? We don't want the same person that locks up the safe to be able to open the safe and ensure everything's in there, right? So subjects initiate actions that interact with objects. Access control policies must verify the identity and permissions of the subjects, okay? And then, of course, here's a subject, some end users, right? A subject, access to processes, running programs, whatever the case may be. And finally, there's the rule. So a rule is an instruction developed to allow or deny access to a system by comparing the validated identity, right? The authentication and authorization, okay, to an access control list. And an access control list is a list of rules, okay? So you might be familiar with these on, say, the software firewall on Windows or Linux, right? Where we can give permission, basically, who can read, who can write, who can execute, who can access, right? These are also on firewalls, in databases, and all over software, okay? So the rules determine whether access should be granted based on a comparison of the subject's credentials against that access control list. So if you think about a corporate firewall and who, can access that corporate firewall, you may need end users to access it for VPN use, but you certainly wouldn't give them administrative rights to, change ports, open ports, change time to live, etc., or, administer the firewall, right? Because then you might find yourself in some serious challenges. So rules are fundamental for enforcing security policies. So, we see these in group policy within Active Directory. They ensure that only authorized subjects can access specific objects. So again, right, if that hacker gets a hold of and is able to authenticate and authorize, but that account that he or she is using does not have the proper rules, they're not going to be able to access the data, right? It just becomes a longer, harder process. And the longer they're in the system, the more opportunity there is for detection, especially if we're running some automated, IDS, IPS, systems. So access control lists, so a little bit more detail, specify individual user or system process permissions. So we might see ourselves in a list many times, okay, if we logically think about this, right? Just to really simplify this, if you understand Excel, you understand there's multiple worksheets in Excel. So maybe one person has access to one worksheet, whereas another person might have access to multiple worksheets, and maybe there's people who don't even have access to the workbook, the Excel file, because it's not part of their job, right? So keep that in mind. And ACL is essentially a table of rules, right, that tells the computer operating system which access rights each user has to a particular system object, such as a file, a directory, whatever the case may be. Can they read, write, execute? That's a great simplified example. So, just go to your Linux machine, right, and run the simple ls-l command, right? Within a directory, you're going to get all the files. You're going to be able to see what those access control lists are as it pertains to that file for, of course, whoever you're logged in and authenticated as, okay? So examples of access control lists, allowing a user to read a specific file but denying write and execute permissions. A firewall specifying that only a certain IP address can access a certain server, okay? Certain ports that are open. So if we've got an email server inside our DMZ, we've got to open that DMZ firewall to accept, ports required for email. Okay. And maybe it's, secure email 443, SMTP 25, whatever the case may be. Okay. ACL's enhanced security, obviously, they're the rules, okay, or the tables, I should say, that hold the rules. We create the rules. Now, who creates these rules? In the end, it's administration, okay, who decides this access. We want to be clear on that. We just implement it as the IT department. We are first and foremost a customer service entity as well as a protection entity for the digital empire. Okay, so maintain detailed and updated ACLs ensures users only have access to necessary resources. We see how this plays with the principle of least privileges, okay, and role-based access control, which we're about to talk about. So logical access controls, automated systems that control an individual's ability to access computer systems, okay. Segregation of duties. There it is. The practice of ensuring that an organizational process cannot be completed by a single user. So, the best examples given is GAAP, General Acceptable Accounting Practices. This is where if someone can process a check, they cannot also sign the check, making the check valid, right? The check has to go to a second entity who can audit the checks and make sure that there's checks and balances, all right? Attribute-based access control. So policies consider various attributes such as the user role, okay, time of access, location, and the type of resource being accessed. So in this case, this could be, it's 2 hours after the business closes, and this end user should only be working inside the organization, and thus after 6 o'clock doesn't have access, right? Now, maybe the user's working and, access hasn't been revoked while the user's there, but if there's an access authentication and authorization made outside the network, say at 9 o'clock at night, we know that that's not the user, okay? Again, keeping things simple. Discretionary access control leaves a certain amount of access control to the discretion of the object's owner. And I made a suggestion on this, or an example, when I said you create a Word document, right? You become the owner of that Word document. And in certain cases, you can go in and assign permissions so that other people can read, but say not modify your document. Mandatory access control, so requires the system itself to manage access controls in accordance with organizational policies. So we see this a lot of time within government entities, where access decisions are made based on strict regulations and are not left to the discretion of individual users, okay? So for example, classified government documents might only be accessible by users with certain security level access, right? And then there is our famed role-based access control. So assigns permissions to users based on their roles within the organization. So for example, all members of the finance department might have access to financial records, but not to human resource files, for example, right? So by implementing these access control models and understanding their nuances, right, organizations can significantly enhance, standardize their security posture, ensuring sensitive information is only accessible to those people who need appropriate permissions. So that brings us to our conclusion. Again, congratulations, you've completed half of the materials or watched half of the lecture. So importance in cybersecurity for the AAA, safeguarding that sensitive information. Again, what is data? It's the new gold in today's digital world. We're ensuring the CIA, that should be in another order. It should be confidentiality, integrity, and availability every time you see it, like it is in this little image here. So core concepts of cybersecurity are authentication, authorization, and access control. Remember, the first line of human is the end user, okay? They create a lousy password because you have a lousy authentication policy, and all bets are off, right? But here, authentication, authorization, and access control, this really is that first line, if not the last line, in securing our empire's digital assets, okay? So initial line of defense verifies identity users. Authorization defines the authenticated users can do, right? So authentication is who they are. Authorization is what they can do. And finally, access controls is managing the permissions through various models and mechanisms. What can they do with the file? What can someone else do with the file? So adapts to evolving threats to maintain security. Impact on security and trust, right? The better we protect our data, the more trust our customers have in doing business with us. Finally, future topics. So, principles and best practices in authentication, authorization, and access control are essential. We have to stay up on them. We have to know what changes have made. Maybe if we're, utilizing a Linux operating system and though the AAAs have been enhanced, with, say, additional authentication mechanisms for better multi-factor authentication, we might want to implement those. But if we don't stay on top of it, we don't know what's available, right? Equip cybersecurity professionals like yourself, you digital defenders, to defend against ever-changing threats. So this is that constant back and forth. And of course, by doing all this, we ensure the security of our digital empires. I will see you next time for Chapter 6, which is digital locksmithing. We're going to talk about cryptography and encryption. Again, part of the process here. Take care. See you.